I will turn it over to Jo to talk about a piece that she recently wrote about who's in love with gender.
I'm going to tell you about Judith Butler's new book. So Judith Butler's new book, Who's Afraid of Gender, was published in February 2025. And it's a queer theory manifesto, which suggests that for people that she calls anti-gender activists, gender is a phantasm. And by that, she means a ghostly conglomeration of everything the conservatives, the religious, the patriarchs, the racists, and indeed the gender critical and radical feminists. So she puts us all together, that we fear and want to destroy gender. And what her thesis in her book is that gender has become a sort of ghostly amalgam of many, many things that we fear. Now, anyone who's read Judith Butler knows this is a typical sort of thing to just make up some idea and it all be very, very sort of unmaterial and moving and postmodern. Anyway, she says anti-gender actors want to restore a racist, patriarchal, religious order. And it's a mistake that radical and gender critical feminists don't join with the LGBTQI+ to fight them. And that's her main thing, is she's saying we shouldn't be afraid of gender, and everybody who's progressive should like gender, as she does. And the most progressive thing to do is to fight the right, and we should all join together to fight it. And that radical and gender critical feminists are mistaken. So the first section of the book, she attacks the religious and the conservatives, and much of it, I would agree with it. So she writes, the idealized past can be found in the anti-gender ideologies movement's call to restore a patriarchal order for family, marriage, and kinship, including proscriptions on reproductive freedoms, gender self-determination, and healthcare for LGBTQI+ people. So she's right that the anti-gender, the right, want to restore the patriarchal order, but then she is joining on to that, that the progressive things that they're trying to destroy are gender self-determination, etc. She's anti-racist, post-colonial, environmentally conscious, and she attacks the right on these issues. But like adding TQI+ onto the LGB, she takes many of the good bits of feminism and adds on some anti-safeguarding, anti-women bits, and then she vilifies the original feminists. She attacks the right and then adds in an attack on gender critical and radical feminists. So, in an example, she criticizes many Christians for only believing in the Bible. And she says the anti-gender advocates are largely committed to not reading critically because they imagine that reading would expose them or subjugate them to a doctrine to which they have from the start levied objections. She then segues into an attack straight away on gender critical feminists and says to be gender critical is thus a misnomer deployed by some feminists who make implicit or explicit alliances with the right-wing opposition to gender. And then she says their views are emphatically objectionable, not only because they reduce gender to a single caricatured version of a complex reality, but also because they misunderstand what critical entails. So it's really hard to read, as shown here, because she repeatedly misrepresents us. Just pretty much many of the sentences are inaccurate in our view, or in my view. And unfortunately, this is where most of the trans rights activists are getting their information from. So this new book, I think, is going to be read very widely by trans rights activists, and a lot of her discourse we will hear if we're talking to trans rights activists. This will be the new line for a year or so, or for a while. She never acknowledges that radical feminists refuse gender because it's a crucial way that we are oppressed. We say that females are forced or groomed into performing gender, sex roles like being kind or doing unpaid work or wearing high heels. We're not afraid of the complexity of gender or reading about it. It's the sexism in gender that we hate. We're not afraid of gender. We hate it. So we want to abolish it. So it's really inaccurate to say that we're scared of it. But Butler loves gender, which she sees as a dynamic location for revolutionary change. Sex, which she says is assigned at birth, is in complex interplay with gender, she says. So this is Butler again, to refuse gender is sadly to refuse to encounter that complexity, to refuse, in other words, to let one's thinking be transformed by the complexity that one finds in contemporary life across the world. So she's saying we're simplistic and we don't have this dynamic view. The message is that gender is part of a wider progressive liberation struggle, and to be afraid of it is misguided fear. Her title, Who's Afraid of Gender, and her thesis that gender has become a phantasm. Her title, Who's Afraid of Gender, and her thesis that gender has become a phantasm, like a spectre haunting Europe, suggests that we are misguided to be wary of gender. But actually, we're very sensible to worry about gender. The Three Little Pigs, I mean, this doesn't show the Three Little Pigs, but it's got some goats. It's got the 7 billy goats gruff. The Three Little Pigs were justifiably scared of the wolf who wanted to blow their houses down and eat them, and cheered each other on, sort of encouraged each other by saying, who's afraid of the big bad wolf? And her title, Who's Afraid of Gender, is very revealing because actually it's reminding us of the dangers wolves actually pose to pigs, or in the picture, goats. And in our case, men, to women and children, whether they're in sheep's or women's clothes or not. Butler criticizes conservatives as having old-fashioned, self-satisfied views about gender, but presents them nevertheless as viewing themselves and the world through a gender lens. So we know that in her book, she's talking to the trans rights activists. She's sort of trying to give them stories and understanding of the world, which fits their worldview that they are part of a wider progressive movement. And so because she's very, very widely read and very supported, it's a real worry that she's saying everybody thinks like this. Now, what she says is some people like to think of their own gender as not only natural, but universal. I'm a man in the same way that everyone else is, and nature makes it so. And many people don't believe in gender, but actually she's sort of accurate because the right wing do believe that women should be women and men should be men, or women should be feminine and men should be masculine. So a lot of what she says, some sentences are actually very accurate, and she's describing the right wing who are really oppressive. And so you can see why she's attractive to many people. She presents gender as a form of freedom, a movement, or a prison. And she writes, you can do gender on the street, celebrating with others the body you inhabit, or find that others have gendered you before you even enter the space. To inhabit a gender is to live out a certain historical complexity that has become possible for the lives we live now. It's attractive because her argument makes the personal breaking of gender roles into a political action to overthrow lots of interconnected oppressions. She talks about them really thoroughly in the book, and talks about the many, many struggles that progressive people are working on. So radical feminists also make the argument that the personal is political and rejection of sex role stereotypes is good. But the difference is that we don't suggest that wearing clothes of the opposite sex actually changes our sex. So Butler glorifies gender as a choice that we can do. She makes gender a thing, a place, a promised land in glorious manifestations. It's freedom, she suggests. She doesn't investigate what's happening in women's prison cells, the girls' changing rooms, gender affirmation clinics, LGBTQ plus youth clubs and relief centres. Just not a word is said about these things. Her description of her beloved gender is also revealing, though. She sort of prepares her followers for some bad things that are going to happen. So she says, gender comes along with vulnerability, penetrability, agency, dependency, illness, social recognition, basic requirements, shame, passion, sexuality, and variable conditions of life and aliveness. Which I mean, if you're a young person trying to work out what on earth's going on, it is quite worrying to think, okay, well, I need to prepare myself for penetrability, particularly for lesbians, but for everybody, really. Butler attacks the word sex in a variety of ways, but I'm going to tell you about two of them. And she muddles the meaning of sex repeatedly with gender and gender with sex. So they're not fixed words, they're amorphous. She says that it is not a fact. So sex isn't a fact, and it's dripping with sexist expectations. So she writes, many people refer to sex as if it's an obvious fact based on observation and worry that academics have needlessly obfuscated plain matters. Yeah. Consider, however, that sex assignment is not simply an announcement of the sex that an infant is perceived to be. It also communicates a set of adult desires and expectations. And it's true that many sexist conservatives want to impose desires and expectations, which we would call gender, on sex, along with sex, and do. But to make out that everyone who believes sex is a fact does that is willful ignorance. Feminists have been fighting sexist stereotypes for centuries. She writes, sex assignment is not a simple description of anatomical facts, but a way of imagining what they will mean or should mean. So because many people have sexist views, she thinks we should get rid of sex. She doesn't mention all the problems, one of which is if we don't have sex disaggregated statistics, women-only shelters, we're going to find it difficult to describe oppression and our lack of power. She then goes on. So at the beginning, she attacks mostly the right and to a little bit the feminists. But then she goes on to, in the middle of the book, she says she's going to consider British debates on the matter of sex, paying close attention to the phantasmatic anxieties found in the argumentation of trans-exclusionary feminists such as J.K. Rowling, the Sex Matters organisation, and the views of Kathleen Stock and the New Zealand, this is what she says, she's from New Zealand, scholar Holly Lawford Smith. So these are the four people that people and group that she attacks. So she says Lawford Smith's reference to radical feminist Andrea Dworkin undermines the whole of the feminist anti-gender argument because Dworkin thought sex was a spectrum, and quotes Dworkin, we are clearly a multi-sex species which has had its sexuality spread along a vast continuum where the elements called male and female are not discrete. And so as far as I know, that's accurate. And so it does, to some extent, undermine our use of Dworkin as part of our argumentation. Although I don't think any of us are really using her as the argument at the moment. But it is true that Lawford Smith did in her book. Lawford Smith's reference to Catherine MacKinnon is also undermining, says Butler, because MacKinnon thought it wasn't necessary to define women, and anyone who's treated as a woman should count. And then Butler, in this section, goes on to dismiss Lawford Smith's defence of single-issue concern for women's rights, which she did, and says that that's not in line with what most feminists who are intersectional, who think we shouldn't actually prioritize women's rights. And to be honest, I think she's quite sort of accurate, and she's picked apart. She's done a really successful attack on Lawford Smith's book, which is a shame, because not everything that Butler's saying is completely inaccurate. And it could even be that most feminists are intersectional, although, you know, I think Lawford Smith's right to say we should be able to have a single issue concern for women's rights. So Butler also criticized J.K. Rowling for writing, if sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. And Butler counters, if sex is legally assigned and registered, it can be reassigned and re-registered. And can be reassigned and re-registered. Can we not conclude that the reality of sex has changed and that change is now part of our historical reality? Sex can be both real and mutable, changeable. Unless we believe that the truth is always immutable and never historical, a proposition that would once again ally Rowling with the papacy. It's really, the whole thing is so irritating. Now, because we're running out of time, I am going to jump to the bottom of my piece and just do the last couple of paragraphs. There's about a page I haven't read out, but you can look at this on Substack if you're interested. So in her attack on feminists who oppose gender identity ideology, Butler does not mention actual radical feminists, most notably Sheila Jeffreys and Kara Dansky, who's here today, who don't fit the picture she's painting. I'd like to see Butler's answer to Sheila Jeffreys' notion of woman face, for instance. I think if she's saying she disagrees with our position, she should actually unpack our position adequately. And she doesn't actually look at any of the radical feminist positions. She says that J.K. Rowling and Kathleen Stock are radical feminists, which is just not true. Neither does Butler mention Laura Lecuona, Julia Long, or Lauren Levy, who have all written very clearly on gender being a form of oppression, the problems with femininity, and the threats to lesbians if men can say they're women. And nor does she mention critiques of gender from the LGB groups, well, the main one being the LGB Alliance. So all of those are not mentioned in this new book, Who's Afraid of Gender? And it's, I think it's disingenuous and very unhelpful to us, because her audience will think that they have had an overview of how bad radical feminists are, and indeed gender critical feminists are, and how wrong we are. But she hasn't actually given us a chance to defend ourselves or laid out our arguments. She's actually misrepresented us. And yes, also my other point is she doesn't mention the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by nearly 40,000 people, 543 organizations worldwide. So I would say probably don't read it. It's quite annoying, and it goes against the conversation that with Kara and Kate just had about looking after ourselves and having a nice time. But it is it is interesting that she's come out with this book. I think it seems to me that she's really the mouthpiece at the moment, and she's making the most sort of coherent argument for the trans rights activists. So it's good to know what's being said, even though it's incredibly irritating. So there we are.